The crack of ice splitting beneath Willow's feet sounded like a gunshot across the frozen Kansas prairie, and in the heartbeat before the world turned to freezing water and chaos, she thought about how foolish it was to die alone on a river in January of 1879. The Missouri River's surface had looked solid enough when she started across, following the tracks of deer and smaller animals that had made the journey before dawn. Willow Dalton had crossed frozen rivers before during her 21 years back in Ohio before the fever took her parents and left her with nothing but a train ticket west and the address of an aunt in Wichita who might take her in. She had thought herself capable, careful even, testing each step as she made her way across the ice-covered expanse. But winter in Kansas was different than winter back home, with its unpredictable thaws and refreezes, and the ice that looked thick enough to hold a wagon had betrayed her halfway across. The cold hit her like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs as she plunged through the broken surface. Her heavy wool coat and the layers of skirts that had seemed so necessary in the bitter January wind now became anchors dragging her down. The current beneath the ice was stronger than she had imagined, pulling at her legs with insistent fingers, trying to sweep her under the solid ice downstream where she would be lost forever. She managed one gasping breath before her head went under, her fingers scrabbling uselessly at the jagged edges of ice that broke away in her hands. She was going to die. The thought came with strange clarity as the cold turned her limbs to lead and the current pulled harder. She had survived the fever that took her family, endured the long journey west, sitting up in third-class rail cars, spent the last of her money on the stagecoach from Kansas City to Wichita, only to drown alone in a frozen river 2 miles outside of town because she had been too proud and too stubborn to wait for the ferry. Something solid caught her wrist. Through the haze of cold and panic, Willow felt strong fingers close around her arm with bruising force. She tried to help, tried to kick her way upward, but her legs would not obey. The grip on her wrist tightened, joined by another hand catching her under the arm, and then she was being hauled upward with shocking strength. Her head broke the surface, and she dragged in a desperate breath that was half air and half water, coughing and choking as she was pulled against the edge of the ice. "I got you," a man's voice said, rough with effort and breathless with exertion. "Don't fight me. Just hold on." Willow's vision was blurred with river water and the dizzying spin of near drowning, but she could make out the shape of him, lying flat on the ice with his arm extended down into the water. He was pulling her up by main strength, his other hand gripping what looked like a rope stretched back toward the riverbank. His hat had fallen off, and his dark hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat despite the freezing temperature. "I cannot," Willow gasped, her teeth already chattering so hard she could barely form words. "Too heavy." "Like hell," the cowboy said, and pulled harder. The ice groaned beneath them both, but held, and then Willow's shoulders were clear of the water, then her waist. Her skirt streamed water and weighed what felt like 100 pounds, but the man did not let go. He shifted his grip, caught her under both arms, and dragged her fully onto the ice. "Don't try to stand. We have to spread the weight out." He was already moving, pulling her along the ice on her belly, away from the jagged hole that had nearly become her grave. Willow tried to help, tried to push with her legs, but they were numb and useless. The world had narrowed to the burning cold, the rough scrape of ice against her cheek, and the steady pull of the man's hands on her shoulders. She could hear him talking, a steady stream of words that might have been encouragement, or might have been curses, she could not tell. Then they were on the bank, and he was lifting her, carrying her away from the river, toward a horse that stood ground-tied in the sparse winter grass. Willow caught a confused impression of a tall man, broad-shouldered under a heavy coat, with a face all hard angles and dark stubble. His eyes were pale, gray or blue, she could not tell, and they were fixed on her with fierce concentration. "My horse," Willow managed through her chattering teeth. "I left her on the other side." "Your horse is smarter than you are, then," the cowboy said bluntly, setting her down just long enough to untie a bedroll from behind his saddle. She stayed on solid ground. He wrapped the blankets around her, his movements quick and efficient, then lifted her again and set her in his saddle. Willow swayed, her hands refusing to grip the saddle horn properly, and he steadied her with one large hand on her back. "How far to town?" he asked, his voice sharp with urgency. 2 miles, Willow whispered. "Maybe less. I was nearly there." The cowboy swore, low and heartfelt, and swung up behind her in one fluid motion. His arm came around her waist, holding her against his chest as he urged the horse into a canter. The movement jarred through Willow's frozen body, but she could not even protest. The cold had sunk into her bones, a deep ache that made her drowsy despite the desperate urgency in the man's movements. "Stay awake," he ordered, his voice close to her ear. "I did not just fish you out of that damn river so you could freeze to death on my horse. What is your name?" "Willow," she managed. "Willow Dalton." "I am Samuel Quinn," he said. "And you were going to stay awake and talk to me, Miss Dalton. Tell me what fool reason you had for crossing that river." "Ferry was 5 miles downstream," Willow said, forcing the words out past her chattering teeth. The effort of speaking seemed monumental, but something in Samuel Quinn's voice demanded obedience. Ice looked solid. Animals had crossed. "Animals do not weigh 100 pounds soaking wet while wearing half a dry goods store worth of skirts," Samuel said. His arm tightened around her waist, and Willow realized she was shaking so hard her teeth were clicking together. "Where were you headed?" "Wichita. My aunt lives there, Sarah Dalton. Do you know her?" "No, but we will find her," Samuel promised. His horse was eating up the distance at a ground-covering lope, his sure-footed gait steady despite the uneven terrain. "Keep talking. Tell me about Ohio." "How did you know I was from Ohio?" Willow asked, confused. "You said back home was different," Samuel said. "And you have that careful way of talking that Easterners have. Tell me about it." So, Willow talked, her voice coming in broken gasps as Samuel held her upright in the saddle. She told him about the little town outside Cleveland where she had grown up, about her father's carpentry shop and her mother's garden. She told him about the fever that swept through in the summer of 1877, taking both her parents within a week of each other. She talked about selling the shop and the house, buying her train ticket west with the proceeds, coming to Kansas because her Aunt Sarah had written once to say there were opportunities in Wichita for a smart young woman willing to work. Samuel listened, asking questions whenever her voice trailed off, keeping her focused and awake as they raced toward town. Willow was aware dimly that she was telling a complete stranger the story of her life, sharing details she had not shared with anyone since leaving Ohio. But his voice was steady and his arm was solid around her waist, and staying awake seemed to require all her concentration. The outskirts of Wichita appeared through the gray winter morning like a salvation. Scattered buildings gave way to more substantial structures, the raw wooden storefronts and houses of a town that was still growing, still finding its shape on the Kansas prairie. Samuel guided his horse straight down the main street, ignoring the curious looks from the few people braving the cold morning. "Doctor," he called to a man sweeping the boardwalk in front of a general store. "Where?" The man pointed down the street. 3 buildings past the hotel on the left. Sign says Morrison." Samuel touched his heels to the horse, and they were moving again. Willow had stopped shaking, which seemed like it should be a good thing, but Samuel swore and held her tighter. Her eyes kept wanting to close, the world graying at the edges. "Nearly there," Samuel said urgently. "Stay with me, Willow, just a little longer." The doctor's office was a narrow building with a painted shingle hanging above the door. Samuel dismounted in one fluid motion, pulling Willow down after him and carrying her toward the door. He kicked it open without ceremony, startling a gray-haired man who looked up from his desk with an expression of annoyance that shifted immediately to concern. "Fell through the ice on the Missouri," Samuel said without preamble, laying Willow on the examination table. 5, maybe 10 minutes ago. I got her out fast, but she is frozen through." The doctor, Morrison according to the sign, was already moving, his hands quick and professional, as he checked Willow's pulse and peeled back the wet blankets. "You did right bringing her straight here. Help me get these wet things off her." What followed was a blur of activity that Willow experienced through a haze of cold and exhaustion. The doctor and Samuel worked together to strip away her soaking wet dress and layers of undergarments, wrapping her instead in dry blankets warmed by the stove in the corner. The doctor made her drink something hot and bitter that burned all the way down, then something else that tasted of honey and herbs. Slowly, painfully, warmth began to creep back into her extremities, bringing with it a burning ache that made her gasp. "That is good," Dr. Morrison said, noting her reaction. "Means you are warming up properly. You were lucky. Another minute in that water, and we would be having a very different conversation." Willow turned her head, searching for Samuel. He was standing by the window, his back to the room, his whole posture rigid with tension. His coat was soaked through, and his shirt clung wetly to his shoulders, where he had lain on the ice to pull her out. You are wet too, Willow said, her voice hoarse. You should get dry. Samuel turned, and in the better light of the doctor's office, Willow got her first clear look at the man who had saved her life. He was perhaps 25, with dark hair that curled slightly when wet, and those pale eyes she had noticed before, gray as smoke. His face was all hard planes and angles, weathered by sun and wind, with a mouth that looked like it did not smile often. He was tall and lean, built like a man who spent his days in the saddle, and there was a quiet competence in the way he moved that spoke of someone accustomed to solving problems quickly. I am fine, Samuel said shortly. You are the one who went for a swim. A swim I would have continued under the ice if not for you, Willow said. Thank you. I owe you my life. Samuel shook his head, looking uncomfortable with the gratitude. You do not owe me anything. Anyone would have done the same. But you are the one who did it, Willow insisted. She tried to sit up, and the doctor pushed her gently back down. You need to stay still and stay warm, Dr. Morrison said firmly. You are going to be fine, Miss Dalton, but I want to keep you here for a few hours to make sure. Sometimes the cold can play tricks on the body even after you are warmed up. He looked at Samuel. And you, young man, should go home and get into dry clothes before you catch your death. You have done your good deed for the day. Samuel hesitated, his eyes on Willow, and she had the strange sense that he did not want to leave. But he nodded finally, reaching for his hat. I will check back later, he said. Make sure you are all right. I will be here, Willow said, managing a weak smile. Unless Dr. Morrison throws me out. Not likely, the doctor said dryly. You mentioned an aunt in town, Miss Dalton? Sarah Dalton, Willow said. I do not know where she lives exactly. I was planning to ask when I arrived. I know Sarah, Dr. Morrison said, his expression softening. She runs the boarding house on 2nd Street. I will send my boy to fetch her once we have you properly settled. Samuel left then, with one last backward glance that Willow felt like a physical touch. Then he was gone, and she was alone with the doctor, who bustled about checking her fingers and toes for frostbite and making her drink more of the hot, bitter medicine. Sarah Dalton arrived an hour later in a flurry of wool skirts and concerned exclamations. She was a tall, spare woman, with Willow's same dark hair streaked heavily with gray, and a face that was all sharp angles and shrewd intelligence. She took one look at her niece laid out on the doctor's examination table, and her expression shifted from concern to relief to exasperation in the space of a heartbeat. You tried to cross the Missouri on the ice, Sarah said flatly. Willow Grace Dalton, of all the fool stunts. I did not know it would break, Willow protested weakly. It looked solid. It is January, and we have had 3 days of temperatures above freezing, Sarah said. Every child in Wichita knows to stay off the river ice this time of year. You could have taken the ferry. The ferry was 5 miles out of my way, and I did not have the money for the fare, Willow admitted. I spent the last of what I had on the stage from Kansas City. Sarah's expression softened slightly. Well, you are here now, and alive thanks to Samuel Quinn. That boy has a habit of being in the right place at the right time. She turned to Dr. Morrison. Can I take her home, Thomas? Give her another hour by the stove. Then yes, the doctor said. Keep her warm, make her eat and drink plenty of hot liquids, and watch for signs of fever over the next few days. The cold was the immediate danger. But river water is not clean, and she swallowed a fair amount of it. Sarah nodded briskly and pulled a chair up beside the examination table, taking Willow's hand in hers. Her fingers were warm and dry and strong, and Willow felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes. She had not realized how much she had needed someone, how alone she had felt since leaving Ohio, until her aunt's solid, no-nonsense presence filled the little office. I am sorry, Willow whispered. I know you said in your letter that there would be a place for me here, but I did not mean to arrive like this, causing trouble and expense. Hush, Sarah said firmly. You are family, girl. That means something, and you have not caused any trouble that cannot be mended, though I expect you will want to thank Samuel Quinn properly once you are back on your feet. That young man has a good heart, even if he does his best to hide it. Tell me about him, Willow said, curious despite her exhaustion. Sarah settled back in her chair, still holding Willow's hand. Samuel Quinn came to Wichita about 3 years ago, during the big trail drive season of '76. He was just a boy then, 22, and already harder than most men twice his age. Worked as a drover, bringing cattle up from Texas, and was good enough at it that he saved his wages instead of drinking them away, like most of the other hands. He bought himself a little piece of land east of town. Nothing much, just enough for a small herd and a house. Works as a horsebreaker mostly now, training mounts for the army post at Fort Dodge and for ranchers who need a good hand with difficult animals. He seems very capable, Willow said, remembering the efficient way Samuel had moved, the strength in his arms as he pulled her from the water. Capable is a good word for Samuel, Sarah agreed. He is not much for socializing, keeps to himself mostly. But he is honest and hardworking, and he does not drink or gamble. Half the mothers in town have tried to throw their daughters at him. But he has not shown interest in any of them. I think he had some trouble in his past, before he came to Kansas. He does not talk about it, but you can see it in his eyes sometimes. Willow thought about those gray eyes, the fierce concentration in them as he held her on the ice, the way he had refused to let the current take her. She owed him her life, a debt she had no idea how to repay. The hour passed slowly, Willow drifting in and out of an exhausted doze while Sarah sat beside her, occasionally pressing more hot tea into her hands. Finally, Dr. Morrison declared her fit to leave, with strict instructions to rest and stay warm. Sarah had brought dry clothes, practical wool dress, and underthings that were slightly too large but blessedly warm and dry. Willow dressed with shaking hands, her body still weak from the ordeal, and let her aunt wrap her in a heavy cloak before leading her out into the cold January afternoon. The boarding house on 2nd Street was a substantial 2-story building with a wide front porch and cheerful yellow curtains in the windows. Sarah explained as they walked that she ran it for travelers and long-term residents, mostly men who worked in town but had no families of their own. It was respectable and profitable, and there was a small room on the 2nd floor that would be Willow's. The room was tiny but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the street. Willow sank onto the bed with a sigh of relief, every muscle in her body aching with exhaustion. "Sleep now," Sarah said firmly, pulling a thick quilt up over her niece. "We will talk about your plans and what work you might find in town after you have rested. And tomorrow, if you are feeling up to it, we will pay a visit to Samuel Quinn so you can thank him properly." Willow meant to protest that she was not tired, that she wanted to help her aunt, that she needed to start looking for work immediately so she would not be a burden. But the bed was soft, and the quilts were warm, and the cold had taken more out of her than she realized. She was asleep before Sarah left the room, falling into dreams of freezing water and strong hands pulling her towards safety. She woke to late afternoon light slanting through the window, and the smell of something savory cooking downstairs. Her body ached in places she had not known could ache, and her throat was raw from the river water she had swallowed. But she was warm and dry and alive, which seemed like more than she had any right to expect. Willow dressed slowly, her fingers still clumsy with cold and exhaustion, and made her way downstairs. The boarding house dining room was a large space with 3 long tables and a huge cast-iron stove against one wall. Sarah was stirring something in a pot, and 2 men sat at one of the tables, playing cards and talking in low voices. They looked up as Willow entered, their expressions curious but not unfriendly. "This is my niece, Willow Dalton," Sarah announced. "She will be staying here and helping me run the place. Willow, this is Henry Cooper and James Wilkes. Henry works at the freight office, and James is a clerk at the land office." The men nodded politely, and Henry, an older man with a weathered face and kind eyes, said, "Heard you had quite an adventure this morning, Miss Dalton. Lucky Samuel Quinn was out riding early." "Very lucky," Willow agreed. "Do you know him well?" "Well enough," Henry said. "He brings his horses into town sometimes to show buyers. Quiet fellow, but good with animals. Better with animals than people, most would say." "Henry," Sarah said warningly, but there was amusement in her voice. "It is true," James put in. He was younger than Henry, perhaps 30, with the soft hands of a man who worked with papers rather than ropes. "Samuel Quinn is about as social as a lone wolf, but he is honest and fair, which counts for more in my book." Willow filed this information away, curious about the man who had saved her life. She helped her aunt serve dinner to the boarders, 6 men in all who came in throughout the evening, and then sat down to her own meal of beef stew and fresh bread. Her appetite, which she had thought non-existent after the morning's ordeal, returned with a vengeance, and she ate 2 helpings, while Sarah looked on with approval. That night, lying in her narrow bed under the thick quilts, Willow thought about the moment the ice broke beneath her feet. She thought about the cold, the panic, the certain knowledge that she was about to die. And she thought about Samuel Quinn's voice, rough with effort, saying, "I got you." She owed him her life, a debt she would never be able to fully repay. But she could at least thank him properly and make sure he knew that his bravery had not been wasted on someone who did not appreciate it. The next morning dawned cold but clear, the kind of brilliant winter day where the sky seemed to stretch forever above the endless prairie. Sarah declared Willow fit enough for a short outing, and they set out together toward the east edge of town where Samuel's property lay. It was about a mile walk, following a rutted wagon road that cut through open grassland, dotted with the occasional stand of cottonwood trees. Samuel's place, when they reached it, was modest but well-maintained. The house was small, probably no more than 2 rooms, built of sod with a wooden door and 2 glass windows that would have been expensive this far west. There was a barn that looked newer than the house, built of milled lumber, and several corrals made of split rail fencing. In one of the corrals, a dark horse was circling at the end of a long rope, while Samuel stood in the center, his movements patient and unhurried. He looked up as they approached, his eyes widening slightly in surprise. He secured the horse's rope and walked toward the fence, his movements easy and confident. He had cleaned up since yesterday, his dark hair neatly combed and his jaw freshly shaved, and he wore clean work clothes under a heavy coat. "Miss Dalton," he said, nodding to Willow and then to Sarah. "Mrs. Dalton, did not expect to see you out here." "I came to thank you properly," Willow said, finding her voice. In the clear morning light, Samuel Quinn was even more striking than she remembered, all lean strength and quiet competence. "You saved my life yesterday. I know saying thank you is not enough, but I do not know what else to offer." Samuel looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Like I said yesterday, anyone would have done the same. I am just glad I was out riding early and saw you on the ice." "But you were the one who risked yourself," Willow persisted. "You could have gone through the ice too. You could have been swept under the current trying to pull me out." "But I was not," Samuel said simply. "And you are all right, so there is no debt to be repaid." He hesitated, then added, "How are you feeling? No fever or lasting effects?" "Sore and tired, but otherwise well," Willow said. "Thanks to you and Dr. Morrison." They stood there for a moment, an awkward silence stretching between them. Sarah, bless her, broke it by saying, "Samuel, I am having a dinner at the boarding house on Sunday evening, just a small gathering, but good food and pleasant company. Would you come?" Samuel looked trapped, his eyes darting between Sarah and Willow. "I am not much for social gatherings, Mrs. Dalton." "I know," Sarah said serenely, "but it would please me, and it would please Willow, and you would be doing me a favor. I need someone to carve the roast, and I am tired of asking Henry Cooper to do it. His hands shake these days, and we end up with shredded beef instead of proper slices." It was such a blatant manipulation that Willow almost laughed, but Samuel, apparently immune to social subtlety, just nodded slowly. "I suppose I could do that. What time?" 6 o'clock, Sarah said promptly. "Do not dress up. It is not that kind of evening. Just come as you are." They walked back toward town, leaving Samuel to his horse training. Willow looked back once and saw him standing by the corral fence, watching them go. When he saw her looking, he lifted one hand in a brief wave before turning back to his work. "You are matchmaking," Willow said to her aunt. "I am doing no such thing," Sarah replied, but her eyes were twinkling. "I am simply being neighborly and giving you a chance to properly thank the man who saved your life. What happens after that is entirely up to you and Samuel." The days between that visit and Sunday dinner passed in a blur of activity. Willow threw herself into helping her aunt run the boarding house, learning the routines of cooking for 8 hungry men, managing the endless laundry, and keeping the rooms clean and orderly. It was hard work, harder than anything she had done in Ohio, but it was satisfying too. She liked the straightforward nature of it, the way each task had a beginning and an end, the way Sarah praised her when she did well and corrected her when she made mistakes. She also learned more about Wichita and its inhabitants. The town was growing rapidly, fueled by the cattle trade and the railroad that had arrived in 1872. It was rough around the edges, with more saloons than churches and a transient population of cowboys and gamblers that gave it a wild reputation. But there were good people here too, families trying to build lives on the prairie, business owners working to establish something permanent in this temporary feeling place. And she thought about Samuel Quinn more than she probably should have. She found herself asking questions about him, casual inquiries that Sarah answered with knowing looks. She learned that he had a reputation for being able to gentle the most difficult horses, that he was scrupulously honest in his dealings, and that he lived alone on his little piece of land with only his horses for company. She learned that he had been seen in the company of a woman once, years ago, when he first came to Wichita. But whatever that relationship had been, it had ended badly. Since then, he had kept to himself. Sunday arrived with threatening clouds and a bitter wind that promised more cold weather. Sarah cooked all afternoon, producing a roast beef that smelled like heaven, along with roasted potatoes, winter vegetables, fresh bread, and an apple pie made with fruit she had preserved from the fall harvest. The boarders gathered in the dining room, drawn by the smell of good food and the promise of company. And at precisely 6 o'clock, there was a knock at the door. Willow opened it to find Samuel standing on the porch, his hat in his hands and his expression uncertain. He had made an effort, she saw, wearing clean trousers and a shirt that looked freshly pressed, his hair still damp from washing. He looked desperately uncomfortable, like a man facing a firing squad, and Willow felt a surge of affection for him that surprised her with its intensity. "Come in," she said warmly, stepping aside. "You are right on time." Samuel entered, nodding to the assembled boarders and accepting Sarah's cheerful greeting with visible relief. He carved the roast with practiced efficiency, his hands steady and sure, and then sat at the end of one table at Sarah's direction. Willow found herself seated across from him, close enough to see the faint scar on his jaw and the calluses on his hands from years of working with ropes and reins. The dinner was loud and cheerful, the boarders trading stories and jokes, while Sarah kept everyone's plates full. Samuel said little, but Willow noticed that he listened intently, his gray eyes moving from speaker to speaker, and when someone asked him a direct question about horse training, he answered with quiet authority. After dinner, the boarders drifted off to their various pursuits, some heading out to the saloons, others settling in the parlor with pipes and newspapers. Sarah shooed Willow and Samuel toward the front porch, claiming she needed to clean up and did not need help. It was so obvious a maneuver that Willow felt her cheeks heat with embarrassment, but Samuel just followed her outside, settling on the porch steps with his elbows on his knees. "Your aunt is not subtle," he observed, his voice dry. "No, she is not," Willow agreed, sitting down beside him. The evening was cold but not unbearable, and she had brought her shawl. "I am sorry if this is uncomfortable for you." Samuel shook his head. "It is not uncomfortable exactly. I am just not used to social occasions. I spend most of my time with horses, and they do not require conversation." Willow laughed. "I imagine they are better listeners than most people." "They are," Samuel said, and there was the ghost of a smile on his face. "They do not judge, they do not lie, and they are honest about their feelings. You always know where you stand with a horse." "Is that why you prefer them to people?" Willow asked. Samuel was silent for a long moment, his eyes on the darkening street. "I have found that people are complicated," he said finally. "They want things from you. They have expectations. They get hurt, and they hurt you back. Horses are simpler. Treat them fair, and they will do the same." There was a story there, Willow thought, some hurt in Samuel's past that made him wary of human connection. But she did not press. Instead, she said, "I wanted to thank you again for saving me. I know I already said it, but it bears repeating. You gave me my life back when I thought it was over." Samuel turned to look at her, his gray eyes serious. "What will you do with it?" "Your life, I mean, now that you are in Wichita." "Help my aunt to start," Willow said. "Beyond that, I do not know. I can read and write and do figures. I know how to keep house and cook and sew. Maybe I will find work as a seamstress or a teacher. Maybe I will just stay at the boarding house and make that my life. I have not decided yet." "You should do something that makes you happy," Samuel said. "Life is too short to spend it doing things you hate." "What makes you happy?" Willow asked. Samuel thought about it, his expression serious. "Working with horses, seeing an animal that is scared or mean get calm and trusting. Building something with my own hands, watching the sun come up over the prairie." He paused, then added quietly, "Talking with you, right now, that makes me happy too." Willow felt her breath catch. There was something in the way he said it, simple and honest and completely without artifice, that touched her more deeply than any flowery compliment could have. "I am happy talking with you too," she said softly. They sat in companionable silence as the darkness deepened and the first stars appeared in the clear winter sky. Eventually, Sarah called them in, claiming it was too cold for sitting outside, and Samuel took his leave with promises to return for dinner the following Sunday if the invitation stood. It became a pattern over the following weeks. Samuel would come to Sunday dinner, carve the roast, eat with the boarders, and then spend an hour or two talking with Willow on the porch or in the parlor if the weather was too bitter. They talked about everything and nothing, easy conversations that flowed naturally from one topic to another. Willow told him about Ohio, about her childhood and her parents and the life she had left behind. Samuel, more slowly and with more reluctance, told her about growing up in Missouri, about a father who drank and a mother who died when he was 12, about leaving home at 16 to work on a riverboat, and then hiring on as a drover when the cattle trade opened up after the war. He did not talk about what had happened in the years between hiring on as a drover and arriving in Wichita, and Willow did not push. She could sense there was pain there, old hurts that Samuel kept locked away behind his quiet exterior. But she also sensed that he was opening up to her, slowly and carefully, like a wild animal learning to trust. By early February, Willow had to admit to herself that she was falling in love with Samuel Quinn. It was not a sudden, overwhelming thing, but rather a gradual realization that she looked forward to Sundays more than any other day of the week, that she found herself thinking about him at odd moments, that the sound of his voice and the rare gift of his smile made her heart beat faster. She had not meant to fall in love, especially not so soon after arriving in a new place with her life still so unsettled. But the heart, she was learning, did not consult the head before making its choices. The question was whether Samuel felt the same way. He was so hard to read, his emotions carefully controlled, his true feelings hidden behind that quiet, competent exterior. He seemed to enjoy their conversations, sought her out when he came to the boarding house, and sometimes she caught him looking at her with an expression she could not quite decipher. But he had made no move to court her properly, had not asked to take her driving, or suggested any kind of outing beyond their Sunday evening talks. Sarah, watching this slow dance with increasing impatience, finally took matters into her own hands. On a Thursday afternoon in mid-February, she announced that Willow needed fabric for a new dress and that they should visit the dry goods store. The store, owned by a cheerful man named Martin Henderson, occupied a corner building on Main Street. It was crowded with barrels of flour and sugar, shelves of canned goods, and bolts of fabric in every color imaginable. Sarah steered Willow toward the fabrics, chattering about patterns and colors, while Martin bustled around helping other customers. They were examining a bolt of blue cotton when the door opened and Samuel walked in. He stopped when he saw them, surprise and pleasure crossing his face in quick succession. "Miss Dalton, Mrs. Dalton," he said, touching his hat brim. "Did not expect to see you here." "We are shopping for fabric," Sarah said brightly. "Willow needs a new dress for spring. What brings you to town on a Thursday, Samuel?" "Needed some supplies," Samuel said, gesturing vaguely at the shelves. "Coffee and flour, mostly. Some nails for repairs on the barn." "Well, do not let us keep you," Sarah said. Then, with absolutely no subtlety at all, she added, "Although Willow could use a man's opinion on this fabric. Does the blue suit her, do you think? Or should she go with the green?" Willow wanted the floor to open up and swallow her, but Samuel just stepped closer, his eyes moving from the fabric to Willow's face with serious consideration. "The blue," he said after a moment. "It matches your eyes." Willow felt heat rush to her cheeks. "You noticed the color of my eyes?" "I noticed everything about you," Samuel said quietly, and there was something in his voice that made Willow's heart skip a beat. "From the first moment I pulled you out of that river." Sarah, bless her, suddenly remembered she needed to speak with Martin about an order and disappeared toward the back of the store, leaving Willow and Samuel standing together among the bolts of fabric. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. "Samuel," Willow began, not sure what she wanted to say. "Would you like to come out to my place?" Samuel interrupted, the words coming out in a rush. "This Sunday, I mean. I could drive you out after church, show you my horses, maybe cook you lunch. Your aunt too, of course," he added quickly. "I would like that," Willow said, smiling. "Very much. And I think we can leave my aunt at home, unless you really want her there." "No," Samuel said, and now he was smiling too, a real smile that transformed his serious face. "I want it to be just you, if that is all right." "It is more than all right," Willow said softly. That Sunday was the longest church service Willow had ever sat through. She tried to pay attention to Reverend Matthew's sermon about patience and virtue, but her mind kept wandering to the afternoon ahead. Sarah kept giving her knowing looks, and Willow had to resist the urge to fidget like a child. Samuel was waiting outside the church with a buggy, borrowed from someone, because he usually traveled only on horseback. He helped Willow up onto the seat with a careful courtesy, and they set off eastward toward his property. It was a beautiful February day, unseasonably warm, with the first hints of spring in the air. The prairie was still brown and dormant, but there was a softness to the light that promised renewal. Samuel's house looked better in the daylight than it had during Willow's first visit. There were curtains in the windows now, simple but cheerful, and someone had planted rose bushes by the front door that would bloom in the spring. The barn and corrals were neat and well maintained, and several horses looked up curiously as the buggy approached. "It is not much," Samuel said, helping Willow down, "but it is mine, free and clear. I saved for 3 years to buy this land and build the barn." "It is wonderful," Willow said honestly. "You have built something real here, something that will last." Samuel showed her around, his pride evident in the way he talked about the horses he was training, the improvements he had made to the property, his plans for the future. He had 4 horses in various stages of training, from a young gelding barely saddle broken to a mature mare that was ready to sell. He worked with each one while Willow watched, his movements patient and sure, his voice calm and steady. "You have a gift," Willow said, as Samuel ran his hands down the young gelding's legs, checking for heat or injury. "The horses trust you." "Trust has to be earned," Samuel said. "You cannot force it. You cannot hurry it. You just have to be patient and consistent and prove that you are not going to hurt them." He paused, then added quietly, "It is the same with people, I think." They went into the house for lunch, a simple meal of bread and cheese and cold roast beef that Samuel had prepared that morning. The house was just 2 rooms, as Willow had guessed, a main room that served as kitchen and living space, and a smaller bedroom beyond. It was sparse but clean, furnished with handmade furniture and a few personal touches, a photograph on the wall, a well-worn book on the table. "Tell me about Missouri," Willow said as they ate. "You said you left when you were 16. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on his plate. "My father drank," he said finally. "After my mother died, he got worse. He was not a mean drunk, just a sad one. He would sit by the fire and cry for hours, talking to my mother like she was still there. I took care of him for 4 years, worked odd jobs to keep us fed, but it was not enough. He died the winter I turned 16, just gave up and let the cold take him. After that, there was nothing keeping me there." "I am sorry," Willow said softly. "It was a long time ago," Samuel said, but there was old pain in his eyes, the kind that never quite heals. "I worked on a riverboat for a while, then hired on with a trail drive heading from Texas to Kansas. That is where I learned about horses and cattle. The trail boss, man named Jacob Hart, he was good to me, taught me everything he knew about working stock. I saved every penny I could, did not drink or gamble like the other hands. When I had enough, I bought this land and started over." "You left something out," Willow said gently. "Sarah mentioned that you had been seen with a woman when you first came to Wichita." Samuel's jaw tightened. "Sarah talks too much." "She was not gossiping," Willow said. "I asked about you. I wanted to know." Samuel stood abruptly, walking to the window with his back to her. For a long moment, Willow thought he would not answer. Then he said, "Her name was Catherine. I met her in '76, right after I bought this place. She was pretty and charming, and I thought I loved her. I thought she loved me too. I asked her to marry me, and she said yes." "What happened?" Willow asked. "I found out she was already married," Samuel said flatly. "Had a husband back in St. Louis that she had run out on. She was just using me, looking for someone to take care of her until she could figure out her next move. When I found out, when I confronted her, she laughed at me. Said I was a fool for thinking someone like her would actually want to spend her life on a dirt farm with a nobody cowboy." He turned back to Willow, his expression bleak. "She was right. I was a fool." "No," Willow said firmly, standing and crossing to him. "She was the fool for not seeing what you are really worth. You are honest and hardworking and kind. You saved my life without thinking about the danger to yourself. You treat animals and people with respect. That makes you worth more than 1,000 charming liars." Samuel looked down at her, something shifting in his gray eyes. "Willow," he said, his voice rough, "I am falling in love with you," Willow said, the words coming out in a rush before she could stop them. "I know it has only been a few weeks. I know we are still learning about each other. But I cannot help how I feel, and I thought you should know." For a long, terrible moment, Samuel said nothing. Then he reached out and cupped her face in his calloused hands, tilting her head up to meet his eyes. "I have been in love with you since the moment I pulled you out of that river, and you looked at me like I was a hero instead of just a man doing what needed doing," he said. "I tried to fight it, tried to tell myself it was too soon, that I did not know you well enough, that I would just get hurt again. But the truth is, Willow Dalton, you have had my heart since that first day, and I do not want it back." Then he kissed her, gentle and careful, like she was something precious that might break. Willow melted into him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart under her palms. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, and Willow felt heat bloom through her entire body. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "I want to do this right," he said. "I want to court you properly, ask your aunt's permission, make sure you are certain about this. I do not have much to offer you, just this little piece of land and a lot of hard work. But what I have is yours, if you want it." "I want it," Willow said simply. "I want you, and we will do it properly if that is what you need. But Samuel, I am already certain. I knew it the first time we sat on my aunt's porch and talked for hours. I knew it when you told me about your father and your mother and your dreams for this place. I am certain." Samuel kissed her again, then pulled her into his arms, holding her close. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped up in each other, while the afternoon sun poured through the windows and the horses nickered softly outside. They courted properly over the following weeks, Samuel calling at the boarding house twice a week in addition to Sunday dinners, sometimes taking Willow driving, sometimes just sitting in the parlor talking, while Sarah hovered nearby with transparent approval. He brought her small gifts, wildflowers from the prairie in early March, a book of poetry he thought she would like, a length of blue ribbon that matched her eyes. In late March, Samuel asked Sarah's permission to marry Willow. A formal conversation in the boarding house parlor that Sarah later reported had included a thorough interrogation about his prospects, his plans for the future, and his intentions toward her niece. Samuel had apparently passed every test because Sarah gave her blessing with enthusiasm and immediately began planning a wedding. They were married on a Sunday in April of 1879 in the little church in Wichita, with half the town in attendance. Willow wore a dress made from that blue fabric Samuel had chosen, and Samuel wore a new suit that made him look uncomfortable but devastatingly handsome. Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony, and when Samuel kissed his bride, there was not a dry eye in the church. The wedding breakfast at the boarding house was a loud, joyful affair, with food and music and dancing that lasted late into the afternoon. Then Samuel swept Willow up into his borrowed buggy, and they drove out to his place, which was now their place, to begin their life together. That first night, as husband and wife, was awkward and sweet and full of nervous laughter. Samuel was gentle and patient, taking his time, making sure Willow felt safe and cherished. And when they finally came together, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, two people who loved each other, learning how to express that love in a new and profound way. The months that followed were among the happiest of Willow's life. She threw herself into making their small house a home, sewing curtains, planting a garden, learning to cook on the temperamental stove. Samuel taught her to ride, patiently walking beside her on his steadiest mare until she felt confident enough to venture out on her own. They worked side by side, training horses, building fences, planning improvements to the property. It was hard work, harder than anything Willow had done before. But it was satisfying too, seeing the direct results of their labor, knowing that everything they built was theirs and would last. And at the end of each long day, they would sit together on their front step, watching the sun set over the prairie, and Samuel would take her hand and tell her he loved her, and Willow would think that she had never been so happy in her entire life. In July, Willow realized she was pregnant. She was not sure at first, but when her monthly courses failed to appear for the second time, and she started feeling queasy in the mornings, she could no longer deny it. She told Samuel one evening over dinner, simply and directly, and watched joy bloom across his face like sunrise. "A baby," he said wonderingly, reaching across the table to take her hand. We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Willow asked, suddenly nervous. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Samuel said. He stood, pulling her up into his arms, holding her like she was made of glass. "You have given me everything, Willow. A home, a family, a reason to wake up every morning with joy instead of just duty. I do not have words for how much I love you." The pregnancy was relatively easy, though Willow tired more quickly and had to give up some of the harder physical work. Samuel fussed over her like a mother hen, insisting she rest, doing more than his share of the household chores, driving into town twice a week to check with Dr. Morrison and make sure everything was progressing normally. In February of 1880, almost exactly a year after that first Sunday afternoon at Samuel's house, Willow went into labor. It was a long, difficult birth that left her exhausted and Samuel white-faced with worry. But when Dr. Morrison finally placed their son in Willow's arms, all the pain and fear melted away. He was perfect, small and red-faced and howling lustily, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would eventually settle into the same gray as his father's. They named him Thomas Jacob Quinn, after the doctor who had cared for Willow and the trail boss who had been kind to Samuel. He was a good baby, healthy and strong, and Samuel proved to be a natural father, gentle and patient, and completely besotted with his son. Life settled into a new rhythm, organized around the needs of a growing baby. Willow had never been so tired in her life, but she had never been so content either. She loved watching Samuel with Thomas, the way his hard face softened when he held his son, the way he would sing old trail songs in a surprisingly good voice to soothe the baby to sleep. The years passed in a blur of work and love and small joys. Thomas grew into a sturdy, curious toddler, then a bright-eyed boy who followed his father everywhere, learning about horses and cattle and the land. In 1882, Willow gave birth to twin girls, Emma and Anna, who kept them all on their toes with their boundless energy and mischievous natures. Samuel added rooms to the house to accommodate their growing family, building with his own hands the extra bedrooms and a larger kitchen. The horse training business grew too, Samuel's reputation spreading throughout Kansas and into neighboring territories. He was known as the man who could gentle any horse, no matter how wild or mean, and buyers came from as far as Colorado to purchase his carefully trained animals. The money was not extravagant, but it was steady and reliable, enough to support their family comfortably and put some aside for the future. Sarah visited often, delighting in her great-niece and nephews, bringing news from town and supplies from the store. She had sold the boarding house in 1883 and bought a smaller place for herself, claiming she was getting too old to manage 8 hungry men. But she was still sharp as ever, still full of opinions and advice that Samuel tolerated with good-natured patience. In the spring of 1885, when Thomas was 5 and the twins were 3, Willow stood in the doorway of their house watching her family. Samuel was in the corral with Thomas, teaching him how to hold a rope properly, while the twins played in the dirt nearby, building something elaborate with sticks and stones. The prairie stretched green and endless around them, the air warm with the promise of summer, and Willow felt such a surge of love and gratitude that it brought tears to her eyes. Samuel looked up and saw her watching, his stern face breaking into the smile he reserved only for her and the children. He said something to Thomas and walked toward the house, his long strides eating up the distance. "What is wrong?" he asked, concern in his gray eyes as he saw her tears. "Nothing is wrong," Willow said, wiping her eyes. "I was just thinking about the day I fell through the ice, how close I came to dying, how different my life would be if you had not been there." Samuel pulled her into his arms, resting his chin on top of her head. "I was there," he said simply, "and I will always be here, Willow, for as long as we both live." "Promise?" Willow asked, her voice muffled against his chest. "Promise," Samuel said. "You are stuck with me now." They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other while their children played nearby and the Kansas wind whispered through the prairie grass. Then Thomas called out that he had finally gotten the rope to do what he wanted, and the twins decided they needed their mother's help with their construction project, and the moment passed into the ordinary chaos of family life. But Willow carried it with her, that feeling of perfect contentment, of being exactly where she was meant to be. She had come west running from grief and loss, had nearly died in a frozen river, and had been saved by a quiet cowboy who had become her entire world. It was not the life she had imagined for herself back in Ohio, but it was better than anything she could have dreamed. The years continued to unfold in a gentle pattern of seasons and milestones. Thomas grew tall and serious like his father, with the same quiet competence and gift with animals. The twins grew into beautiful, lively girls who kept their parents constantly entertained with their schemes and adventures. In 1887, Willow gave birth to another son, David, who proved to be the gentlest and most thoughtful of all their children. Samuel's business continued to prosper. He hired help as needed, young men who wanted to learn the trade, and some of them stayed on as permanent hands. He bought more land when it became available, gradually expanding their property until they had a proper ranch with good grazing and water rights. But through all the changes and growth, the core of their life remained the same. Samuel and Willow, partners in every sense of the word, working side by side to build something lasting. They had their disagreements, of course, moments of frustration or misunderstanding that came from two strong-willed people living in close quarters. But they had learned early to talk through their problems, to listen to each other, to remember that they were on the same side. On quiet evenings after the children were in bed, they would sit together on the porch they had built together, watching the stars emerge in the vast Kansas sky. Samuel would hold Willow's hand, his thumb tracing circles on her wrist, and they would talk about their day, their plans, their dreams. And always before they went inside to bed, Samuel would pull her close and whisper that he loved her, that saving her from that frozen river was the best thing he had ever done. Sarah lived to see her 80th birthday, surrounded by Willow's growing family and the many friends she had made in Wichita. She died peacefully in her sleep in 1890, and they buried her in the town cemetery with full honors. At the funeral, Sarah's pastor spoke of her generosity and strength, her willingness to take in a young niece and give her a chance at a new life. Willow wept openly, mourning the aunt who had been more of a mother to her than her own mother had been able to be. But life went on, as it always does. The children grew and started their own lives. Thomas, at 18, announced his intention to work full-time on the ranch, having no desire for any other life. The twins, always inseparable, married brothers from a neighboring ranch in a double ceremony that was the talk of Wichita for months. David, the gentle one, surprised everyone by announcing his intention to become a doctor, inspired by the stories Willow told about Dr. Morrison saving her life. Samuel and Willow grew older together, their bodies showing the effects of years of hard work, but their love undiminished. Samuel's hair went gray at the temples, then fully silver, and Willow's face gained laugh lines around her eyes and mouth. But when Samuel looked at her, he still saw the young woman he had pulled from the frozen river, brave and beautiful and full of life. And when Willow looked at him, she still saw the man who had risked everything to save her, her hero and her partner, and the love of her life. In the spring of 1895, on their 16th wedding anniversary, Samuel took Willow back to the place where they had first met. The Missouri River flowed as it always had, wide and powerful, but the ice was long gone with the warming weather. They stood on the bank hand in hand, looking at the water. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I had not been out riding that morning?" Samuel asked. "No," Willow said firmly, "because you were there. You saved me, and we built this life together, and I refuse to imagine any other outcome." "Good," Samuel said, pulling her close, "because I cannot imagine my life without you in it. You are my heart, Willow Quinn. You always have been." They kissed there on the riverbank, surrounded by the spring green of the prairie and the sound of running water. It was not their first kiss or their 1000th, but it held all the promise and passion of the very first one in Samuel's little house, when they had both been brave enough to admit their love. More years passed, bringing joy and sorrow in equal measure. They celebrated the birth of grandchildren, 7 in all, each one a miracle and a blessing. They weathered droughts and hard winters, times when money was tight and the future uncertain. They lost friends to sickness and age, attended more funerals than they cared to count. But through it all, they had each other, and that was enough. On a warm summer evening in 1910, Samuel and Willow sat on their porch watching the sunset. They were both in their 50s now, their children grown and gone, their grandchildren visiting when they could. The ranch was thriving under Thomas's management, the house full of memories and love. Samuel's hand found Willow's as naturally as breathing, their fingers intertwining in a gesture as familiar as it was precious. 31 years, Willow said softly, since you pulled me out of that river." "Best decision I ever made," Samuel said, bringing her hand to his lips, stopping to help a foolish girl who thought she could cross a frozen river. "I was not foolish," Willow protested, laughing. "I was desperate and broke and trying to save ferry fare." "You were foolish," Samuel said, but his voice was full of love, "and brave and beautiful, and everything I never knew I needed. You saved me just as surely as I saved you that day, Willow. You gave me a reason to build something more than just a business. You gave me a family, a home, a life worth living. We gave those things to each other," Willow corrected gently. "That is what love is, Samuel. Not one person saving another, but two people choosing each other every day, building something together that neither could build alone." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank below the horizon and the stars began to emerge. The prairie stretched around them, endless and eternal, bearing witness to their love story. And if Samuel held Willow a little tighter than usual, and if Willow leaned a little more heavily against his shoulder, it was only because they both understood how precious each moment was, how lucky they were to have found each other. The years that followed brought more changes. Samuel and Willow slowed down, letting their son and his wife take over more of the ranch work. They spent their days in simpler pursuits, tending a garden, reading together in the evening, spoiling their grandchildren whenever they got the chance. Age brought its inevitable aches and pains, but it also brought a deep peace, a satisfaction with the life they had built together. In the winter of 1920, Samuel fell ill with pneumonia. Dr. Morrison was long gone, but his successor, a young man named Peters, did everything he could. Willow nursed her husband with fierce determination, barely leaving his side, willing him to fight, to stay with her just a little longer. And Samuel, stubborn as ever, pulled through, though it left him weaker than before. "You are not getting rid of me that easily," he told Willow when he was finally well enough to sit up and take solid food. "We made promises, remember? For as long as we both live." "I remember," Willow said, tears streaming down her face. "I remember every promise we ever made." They had 5 more good years together, years of quiet companionship and deep love. They celebrated their golden anniversary in 1925, with all their children and grandchildren gathered around them, a party that lasted 2 days and featured more food than any gathering had a right to. Samuel and Willow danced together in their front yard, while a fiddle player sawed out old songs. And if their steps were slower than they once were, their love was as strong as ever. Samuel Quinn died peacefully in his sleep in the early spring of 1926. With Willow beside him in the bed they had shared for 47 years. He simply did not wake one morning, his heart having finally given out after more than 6 decades of steady beating. Willow woke to find him gone, his hand still holding hers, his face peaceful in death. The grief was crushing, a physical weight that made it hard to breathe. But Willow did not break. She had learned too much from Samuel about strength and resilience and carrying on even when things seemed impossible. She arranged his funeral with Thomas's help, made sure he was buried in the Wichita Cemetery next to the plot she had already purchased for herself. Half the county came to pay their respects to the man who had been known for his honesty, his skill with horses, and his deep love for his wife. At the funeral, Willow stood dry-eyed while the preacher spoke of Samuel's virtues and his life. But afterward, when everyone had gone and she was alone at the graveside, she finally let herself cry. She wept for the boy who had lost his mother too young, for the man who had been hurt by betrayal and learned to trust again, for the husband and father who had built such a good life from nothing but determination and love. And she wept for herself, for the years she would have to spend without him, for the empty space beside her in their bed, for the loss of the man who had been her partner and her love for nearly half a century. But even in her grief, Willow knew she was lucky. She had been given 47 years with Samuel, 47 years of love and laughter and partnership. She had 4 children, 7 grandchildren, and a new great-grandchild on the way. She had a life full of memories and meaning, all because a cowboy had been riding past a frozen river on a January morning in 1879 and had seen a young woman fall through the ice. Willow lived 5 more years after Samuel's death, surrounded by her family, still sharp-minded and independent, even as her body grew frail. She spent her days in the house Samuel had built and expanded for her, looking at the photographs on the walls, reading and rereading the letters he had written her over the years. And every evening, she would sit on the porch they had shared for so long, looking out over the prairie that had been their home, And she would talk to Samuel as if he were still beside her. She told him about their children's lives, about the grandchildren growing up, about the changes in Wichita and the world beyond. She told him she missed him, that she loved him, that she would see him soon. And sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, with the wind whispering through the grass, she could almost feel his hand in hers, could almost hear his voice saying he loved her too. Willow Dalton Quinn died peacefully in her sleep in August of 1931, at the age of 73. Her children found her in her bed, her face peaceful, one hand stretched out across the empty space where Samuel used to sleep. They buried her beside her husband, their graves side by side under the Kansas sky they had both loved so much. The headstone, paid for by their children, bore both their names and a simple inscription that Thomas had chosen. Together in life, together in death, united by love that conquered fear. And if that seemed overly romantic for a grave marker, no one who had known Samuel and Willow Quinn ever questioned it. They had lived a love story for the ages, a romance born from tragedy and grown into something beautiful and lasting. Years later, their great-grandchildren would ask about them, and the stories would be told again. The story of the frozen river and the brave cowboy who saved the drowning girl. The story of the slow courtship and the Sunday dinners and the life they built together on the Kansas prairie. The story of a love that lasted through hardship and joy, through sorrow and celebration, through everything life could throw at them. And always, the story would end the same way, with Samuel and Willow together forever. Their love, a testament to the power of courage and choice and the simple act of two people deciding that they were better together than apart. It was a good ending, a happy ending, the kind of ending that made the listeners smile even as their eyes grew damp with tears. Because in the end, that is what love stories are supposed to do. They are supposed to remind us that even in the darkest moments, when the ice breaks beneath our feet and the current tries to pull us under, there is always the possibility of rescue. There is always the chance that someone will see us struggling and reach out their hand and refuse to let us go. And if we are very lucky, if we are blessed beyond measure, that person will become our partner and our love and the one we choose to spend our life with. Samuel and Willow had been that lucky, and their story, born from one terrifying moment on a frozen Kansas river, became a legacy of love that would endure for generations to come. It was a reminder that the best things in life often come from the worst moments, that tragedy can be transformed into triumph, and that true love, when it is found and nurtured and cherished, can last not just a lifetime, but forever. The ranch that Samuel built and Thomas expanded continued to thrive, passed down through the generations of Quinn children, who inherited not just land and livestock, but the example of their grandparents' love. And sometimes, on cold January mornings when the wind blew hard across the prairie, the descendants of Samuel and Willow Quinn would stand on their porch and look toward the Missouri River and remember the day it all began. The day the ice broke and the cowboy reached down and pulled up not just a drowning girl, but his entire future, his heart, his reason for living. It was a good story, they all agreed. The very best kind of love story, the kind that was true. And in a world that often seemed harsh and uncertain, knowing that such love had existed, that Samuel and Willow had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together, gave hope to everyone who heard it. Hope that they too might find their person, their partner, their great love. Hope that even when life seemed darkest, rescue might be just a heartbeat away. Hope that love, real and true and lasting, was not just a fairy tale but a possibility for anyone brave enough to reach for it. And so, the story lived on, told and retold, changing slightly with each telling, but always keeping its essential truth, that love is worth fighting for, that two people can build something extraordinary together, and that sometimes the best thing we can ever do is simply be in the right place at the right time, ready to reach out our hand and save someone who needs saving. Because you never know, that moment of courage might change not just their life, but yours as well, setting in motion a love story that will echo through the generations and remind everyone who hears it that happy endings are not just possible, they are worth believing in.